Now you're looking at the KTM 1290 Super Adventure lineup and you can't really decide between the S model and the R model. You already know that the S model comes with a more street bias and the R model comes with more of a off-road bias. But what does that really mean for you as a rider, and where are the actual differences when you compare the two bikes? Where are the compromises that you may have to make, and what are the benefits of choosing one over the other? In this video, I'm going to break it down for you. What's up, my biker friends, and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to talk about the differences between the S and the R model. Now, as a long-term rider of the 1290 Super Adventure series, I owned the S model for 3 years and I just recently upgraded to an R model. Also, I was in a similar place like you guys. For a long time, I didn't really understand what the differences are between the S and the R model. So in this video, we're going to go beyond the marketing talk and actually focus on the stuff that really matters to you as a rider when you pick one over the other. Now, as you may know, the only difference between the S and the R model is in the suspension and the different wheels that the bike comes with. Everything else is identical on the bikes. Now, there's seemingly small differences, but have a large impact when you take a closer look. Now, modern adventure bikes have really managed to have a really wide range of different riding applications that you can do with them. You know, from the comfort touring riding where you can bring a passenger and lots of luggage, you have that long distance comfort, all the way to bikes that push up into the sports ends of motorcycles where you have, you know, high powered motorcycles that can keep up with some of the sports bikes. And then you have the range where they push into the off-road section where they can keep up with some of the off-road bikes. Now, of course, we're talking about the big bore adventure category heavy bikes. There will be limits to how far you can push towards the sports and off-road end. Especially the KTM bikes have given you a huge range of applications. And now with the difference between the S and the R model, you get to decide if you want to push it more towards the street and sport end or towards the off-road end. This video is going to be separated in two parts. We're going to talk about the suspension first, and then we can talk about the wheels, the size and the type of wheels that they're using. Now, when we take a look at the suspension setup of both bikes, you may know that the S model comes with a semi-active suspension system, and the R model comes with a higher spec, fully manually adjustable suspension that also gives more suspension travel. Now, if you take the bikes from the dealership and just take it around the block, you're not going to see a whole lot of differences between the two bikes. And that's when we have to look at sort of the application ranges of both of these bikes. Now, if you're just looking at sort of the sweet spot in the middle, both of these bikes will do equally well. There are differences, but they're not so major. It's not until we push it more towards the off-road riding or towards the street riding where the differences become really apparent. Now, let's start with the off-road part. Now, if we look at what the suspension of a motorcycle is meant to do, it is meant to keep the wheels planted on the ground. So as long as you stay on really well-paved roads, the suspension system doesn't really have to do a whole lot. It is not until we get to off-road tracks where you start to get bumps in the road and you get past the gravel roads where you have rocks and roots and single tracks where that suspension system is now getting a full workout trying to keep the wheels planted. And this is exactly where you see the differences between the S and the R model. The higher spec suspension that the R model has doesn't only provide more suspension travel, but it also copes a whole lot better with all these movements that off-road terrain will offer. Now, the best example that I can have for you is if you compare that to a mountain bike, a fully suspended mountain bike compared to a rigid bike. I don't know if you've ever ridden one, but if you've ever been on a fully suspended mountain bike, it just really soaks up all the bumps. If you take it down a single track, it soaks up all the bumps. So you're just kind of gliding down the hill and you don't really even feel the bumps in the road. Now, if you take the rigid bike and you do the same track, you see all those uneven parts of the track will basically transfer to the chassis, to the rider. You will have the bike that's gonna move a lot. And that's sort of when you compare the S to the R model. And of course, the difference isn't as big as going from a rigid bike to a fully suspended bike. But when you start pushing the bike off-road, that's kind of what it feels like for you as a rider. And now, when I was in Italy with my 1290 Super Adventure S, that was quite apparent. There were certain tracks, they had a lot of rocks in there, and you can tell that the suspension system wasn't really coping well with them. I'm not talking about when the suspension system bottoms out and actually hits the limit, but even in the part in between, you can tell that the suspension system was having a hard time keeping the wheels planted, keeping the bike balanced. So there was a lot of motion coming through the chassis, and it just kind of limits how fast you can ride the bike off-road. And also all those movements start to make the ride pretty unsafe. So you have to, you know, reduce the speed a little bit to make sure that you don't get bucked off the bike. Now, if you do the same thing with an R model, which is much better suited for that, you can tell you can take the bike a lot faster, a lot further, a lot safer, because the suspension system will actually be capable of absorbing all those different uneven bumps in the road and keep the bike really planted. And that's where the major differences come in when you look at the S and the R model. So if we're now moving from sort of the off-road section to the middle touring section where comfort matters, the major differences is actually how you operate and how you interface with the suspension system. The semi-active suspension allows you to make all those changes on the fly. You can change from a very comfortable setting to a very firm sports setting with the click of a button. You can change the preload if you add a passenger, if you add luggage, click of a button. You can have individual changes from the front to the rear on the 2021 models now. There's a lot of stuff that you can do just with a click of a button in a few seconds. Now you can make all those changes too on the R model, but it requires you to get off the motorcycle. For some of these changes, you actually need tools to do that. It takes much longer, and you have to get your head around preload, compression, and rebound settings, and you have to read the manual to understand what you're making in changes there. So it's a lot more involved to understand your suspension setup on the R model than it is with the S model, where it's pretty clear if you're in comfort mode or if you're in sports mode. But if you set up the suspension systems very similarly on the S and the R model, you will feel very little differences between the S and the R model for regular touring riding. It is not until you start pushing it to the sports end of it, when you start to ride faster, when you brake harder, when you take the bike to the track, when you ride down a mountain pass really fast and you need to stop the bike right before you make a hairpin turn. That's when you can feel the differences from the semi-active suspension that the S model has to the R suspension. And one of the most prominent things that you will feel, that any rider will feel on the motorcycle, and it's the nosedive when you start braking hard on the motorcycle. Now, conventional suspension system like the R has will have some degree of nosedive depending on how stiff you have the settings in there, but the bike will start to nosedive as the weight of the rider and the motorcycle shifts forward to the front fork. And you have that on most of these bikes. Now, if you look at semi-active suspension systems, they can actually prevent some of that nosedive. Even if you are in a very plush, soft setting on the semi-active suspension system, the bike will actually notice that you are braking and that the weight's shifting forward, and will actually stiffen up the front forks to prevent a lot of that nosedive that we'd normally see if you did the same setting on the R model. When you have a plush setting and it's very soft, then you will feel a lot of nosedive going forward. And preventing that nosedive is a good thing because it keeps the bike planted and makes sure that there are no geometry changes by compressing the front fork too much, especially when you start to corner. So that's really good for fast on-road riding. And that's then the compromise on the street end that you have to make over the R model. So with everything being the same, you can probably push the semi-active suspension system of the S model a bit further than the R model. Now, one final word on the suspension system. That's something that I actually experienced with my motorcycle. That was the 2018 1290 Super Adventure S. When you have the semi-active suspension system that's built into the KTM, there aren't really any ways to upgrade that suspension. Now, there are many bikes out there that will offer you suspension upgrades. So you put different springs and valves in. There isn't really anything offered for this particular bike. Now, maybe you find a small shop that will sort of tinker around and customize your suspension setting, but there isn't anything off the shelf on the market that you can upgrade your semi-active suspension with on the KTM 1290 Super Adventure S. Now, that's very different on the R model, because on the R model you can do all those changes like changing different spring rates in there. You can change the valving. You can change the entire setup entirely and go for something like the TourTech Extreme Shock if what the KTM Super Adventure R brings stock isn't enough for you. So you can push it further, and there's an upgrade path if you want to actually get even better suspension in the bike. So that's something worth considering. Now let's talk about wheels. There's two things I want to talk about. It's the build of the different wheels, and then we'll talk about sort of the diameter and sizing of the wheels. Now, the first thing is the build. So you will notice that the S model comes with cast alloy wheels and the R model comes with spoked wheels. Now, there's a very good reason for why you have cast alloy wheels on the S model. For street riding, what you want is a lighter, more rigid wheel. That's basically what cast alloy wheels will deliver. And for off-road riding, you need wheels that have a bit more flex. If you start hitting roots or rocks, that the rim actually has some flex built in. So with the spoked wheels, and if you look around, and most of these off-road bikes will have spoke wheels because they can absorb some of that stuff a lot better than a rigid cast alloy wheel. So if you do want to take your bike off-road, you want to go past a gravel road to something that's a bit more challenging, you really need spoked wheels on your bike. That brings me to the diameter of the wheels. You will also notice that the S model comes with smaller wheels, or the R model comes with larger wheels. So on the S model, we'll find a 19-inch front wheel and a 17-inch rear wheel. And then on the R model, we have a 21-inch in the front and an 18 in the rear. So just like with the suspension, the wheel diameter doesn't necessarily mean it's always an advantage to have that. There are certain parts where it really does not matter. If you're running a smaller 19-inch in the front or a larger 21-inch in the front, there are some parts where you'll notice the difference, and especially when it comes to off-road riding, the larger diameter will help you get over obstacles a lot better. Also, if you look at the 21-inch and 18-inch rims, you'll see they are narrower than the street counterparts, so they're better suited for off-road riding, and the right tire choices of giving you more grip in certain situations. Usually that's mud or deep sand, where you can actually feel the difference of having a larger diameter wheel. Now on the other side of the sports spectrum, having smaller diameter tires actually helps you with better handling of the motorcycle. The bike handles easier when the wheel diameter is smaller. Also, the wheels are a bit wider and you get a different tire selection for the 19-inch in the front and the 17 in the rear. You can get tires that are almost sport tires on these bikes, so that allows you to actually combine the smaller wheel diameter with rubber that has more grip. Having a wider tire will basically give you a larger contact patch when you start to lean the bike, and then you combine that with certain wheels that have a lot of grip. That means you can push the bike a lot harder when you corner the bike. That doesn't mean that you can't lean the R model and you can't go fast with the R model, but when you start pushing the limits, you'll be better off riding the S model with the appropriate tires. And that's important for you if you're really a fast road rider, or if you want to take a bike to the track, which I have done with my 1290 Super Adventure S. I've taken it to the track a few times, not to race it, but it was a cornering training. And you can definitely push the bike quite a bit. And I'm not sure if I can push my current R model as much as I did on the S model, if I would feel comfortable doing it. Maybe the tires would have the grip, maybe it would work, but you don't feel very comfortable pushing that limit that you can push with the S model. Of course, if you own already one of these motorcycles, there are changes you can make after the fact. For me, I had the 1290 Super Adventure S and I wanted to take it off-road and I wanted to go past the normal gravel road. So I got myself a set of spoke rims and I combined them with the proper tires, so at least I didn't have to worry about breaking my cast alloy wheels. I had a lot of fun riding the 1290 Super Adventure S on off-road tracks, but it also could tell the limits of the suspension system, and that's eventually the reason why I changed to the R model. It's because of the suspension. So if you're an owner of the R model and you want to go faster road riding and want at least the benefits of having smaller diameter for better handling and also getting a better and wider tire choice for on-road riding, you can go with smaller wheel sets on the R model. You can either get the cast alloy wheels that the S model has, or you can use the spoked wheels with smaller diameter and fit it to your R model. It's pretty easy to do. And that's actually what Thomas did on his 1190R. He was actually riding a smaller wheel set when we were riding the France Tour, for example. So there are changes you can make after the fact if you own one or the other. So hopefully, guys, this shed a little bit of light on the actual differences between the bikes that you won't be able to tell if you just take the bike from the dealership around the block to experience the actual differences. I would urge you to take a test ride with the motorcycle that you want to buy and then ride it in riding conditions where you can experience the actual differences. So when it comes to the R model, ideally you find a place that lets you ride it off-road so you can get a feel between the differences of the S to the R model in the suspension setup. Or if you want to look at the S model, that you can take the bike to a track or faster road, you can really experience the cornering capabilities of that bike. Okay guys, this concludes this video. Hope you found this useful. If you have comments, please leave them in the comments section. I'd be really interested to hear what you have to say. If you like the video, give me a thumbs up. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, ride safe and stay awesome.